Ed Gallardi. We're continuing our video series where we examine New Testament doctrines using only types and shadows from the Old Testament. The particular doctrine we'll be looking at here is water baptism. Some say that water baptism is just a symbolic demonstration to our friends that we become Christians. Others say that it's an integral part of our becoming a Christian. The shadows have lots to say about baptism, and the New Testament places great emphasis on it. So let's see what the shadows say. Again, if you're new to shadows, I encourage you to look at the introductory video I did on types and shadows in the Old Testament. Now, just before we begin, I always like to strengthen your understanding of shadows. So let's have a brief look at the flood of Noah. In Genesis, when Lamech named his son Noah, this is what he said. "This one will give us rest from our work and from the toil of our hands arising from the ground which the Lord has cursed." When the floodwaters subsided, Noah's Ark came to rest on the 17th day of the 7th month. That month was Nisan. So it came to rest on the 17th of Nisan. Noah did provide rest for the people at that time because God gave them meat to eat from then on. Eating meat gave them their required nourishment with a fraction of the effort it took before. But there was a much greater significance to Noah's rest. Christ's resurrection occurred on that very same day of the year, the 17th day of Nisan. Noah's flood gave mankind rest from the curse of sin on the ground. Christ's resurrection gave mankind rest from the curse of sin on our souls. See how beautiful the shadows are? Now let's look at water baptism. There are three great shadows of water baptism in the Old Testament. The first of these is the flood of Noah. Confirmation of that comes in 1 Peter 3:20 and 21, which states, "God kept waiting in the days of Noah during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Corresponding to that, baptism now saves you. Not the removal of dirt from the flesh, but an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ." To correctly interpret shadows, we have to look at the function of the shadow in the physical realm in the Old Testament, and then translate that from the physical to the spiritual. The waters brought 8 people, that's Noah's family, safely through the water from a place where sin was pervasive. It brought them from the place of sin to a place of rest where there was no sin. So water baptism has to do that for us. It takes us from a place of sin to a place where we find a spiritual rest. In other words, from being a sinner to becoming a Christian. Notice that Paul says it's not the effect of the water on the flesh that saves us, but rather it's our appeal to God for a good conscience. That's what baptism is. It's our appeal to God for a clean conscience. The second shadow is circumcision, and confirmation of that comes in Colossians 2, verse 11 and 12. It says, "In him you are also circumcised with a circumcision made without hands, in the removal of the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ, having been buried with him in baptism, in which you were also raised up with him through faith in the workings of God who raised him from the dead." So the function of circumcision in the Old Testament was one of the absolute requirements to become a member of the kingdom of Israel. Genesis 17 states that we were to walk blamelessly before God and be circumcised. In verse 14, it states clearly that if one was not circumcised, he could not be a member of the kingdom of Israel. And note clearly that Paul here says that baptism is an act of faith. It is not a work. The third shadow is that of the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Confirmation of that comes in 1 Corinthians 10, 1 and 2. It says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. So again, we analyze what was happening here. The people were held in bondage in Egypt, and they were unable to worship God as they should. When they passed through the water, they were finally free from their captors, and they could worship God as they should. Listen to the song that Moses and the Israelites sang just after passing through the water. They said, I will sing to the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and its rider he has hurled into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. Israel was physically saved after they passed through the water. Today we are spiritually saved when we were baptized. Incidentally, there was an all-land route that God could have led the Israelites on to get to the promised land. But he said he wouldn't lead them that way because when they saw war, they might return to Egypt. You see the wisdom of God in requiring water baptism of us today. It'd be easy for us to return to our sin after just saying a few words, not making any particularly great commitment. But water baptism is a significant commitment. It's one that we can't ignore and wouldn't easily go back on when troubles came. These three great shadows of baptism all say the same thing. The flood shadow taught us that our baptism takes us from a place of sin to a place of rest. The circumcision shadow teaches us that baptism is a requirement to belong to the kingdom of God. And the Exodus shadow taught us that our baptism takes us from being enslaved to sin to being free. The shadows paint a very clear picture. Baptism is a requirement for salvation. If you're interested in a comprehensive New Testament study of water baptism, I encourage you to write to me at the email shown at the end of this video. If you've been taught that baptism has nothing to do with your salvation, you really need to read this 20-page document. It's free. Now stay tuned until next time when we examine another church doctrine, and once again, we let the shadows speak.